They once said that in the great halls of Europe, even the sound of a feast could make a man tremble. Not from hunger, but from what came after. Roasted meats, sweet wines, buttered sauces, the taste of power itself. Kings and courtiers raised their goblets, proud of their plenty, unaware that every sip was a promise their bodies would later keep. For centuries this was the mark of greatness, to dine beyond need, to show the world you could. Yet among the candles and laughter, pain was already waiting, quiet, invisible, patient. By morning a foot would swell, a hand would stiffen. The very men who ruled empires could no longer bear the weight of their own crowns. They called it the disease of kings. Some called it a curse, but it was neither. It was simply the cost of abundance, a lesson written not in blood, but in wine. This is how the richest food in Europe turned against those who tasted it. How the sweetness of life became its silent affliction. Long before Europe's banquets, the Greeks had already given it a name: gout. The physician Hippocrates called it the arthritis of the rich. He believed it came from phlegm, a kind of inner fog brought on by food, wine, and pleasure. Two of those guesses were right. The truth was simpler and crueler. Gout was the body's rebellion against excess, a buildup of uric acid that hardened into crystals inside the joints, slicing flesh from within like shards of glass. It almost never appeared among the poor. Their meals were bread and broth, their lives a rhythm of work and hunger. But in palaces, diets gleamed with butter, sugar, wine, and meat. Abundance became routine, and routine became risk. By the 1600s, doctors began calling gout the mark of distinction. To suffer was in a way to belong. A noble's limp could signal refinement. Pain became another form of privilege. Those who lacked it were sometimes pitied, as if denied the honors of excess. It was not a disease of survival, but of success, a price that only the comfortable could afford. And as Europe entered its golden age of empire and trade, the tables of the powerful grew heavier, and so did their burden. In 1552, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, prepared to march on France. He ruled half of Europe, armies, faith, and fortune. But as he planned to siege the city of Metz, another enemy rose within him. His legs stiffened, his feet burned. Each step sent knives through bone. Gout had struck again. The campaign collapsed, the French strengthened their defenses, and the war dragged on. For a man who had faced rebellions and kings, it was a humiliation that came from within. 4 years later, weakened and better, Charles abdicated the throne. He retreated to a monastery, surrounded by relics and silence, where even the weight of prayer was pain. He died soon after, a ruler undone not by battle but by supper. Across Europe, the same story echoed. Philip II of Spain, Henry VII and Henry VIII of England, George III and the future George IV all suffered its torment. Lord Byron mocked Louis XVIII of France, calling him Louis the Gouty. Even Benjamin Franklin, far from royalty, joked with his own suffering. In his dialogue with Madame Gout, he imagined the disease as a polite visitor scolding him for gluttony. "You have eaten and drunk too freely, and exercised too little."
Franklin promised reform and, like every sufferer, broke it at the next feast. It was not divine punishment. It was arithmetic. Wine, meat, idleness, and consequence. A disease of kings, born from the very comfort they cherished. Desperation filled the gap where medicine failed. In the 1500s, Andrew Boord suggested baking fermented ox dung and wrapping it around swollen joints with cabbage leaves. A century later, Nicholas Culpeper recommended horseradish and ground elder. Carl Linnaeus claimed that eating wild strawberries from a silver bowl soothed the pain. And then there were the truly bizarre. A German text from 1518 advised roasting a goose stuffed with chopped kittens, incense, wax, and rye flour, the drippings to be rubbed on the sore foot. Even for the rich, some treatments were worse than the disease. By the 1700s, commerce replaced superstition. Bottles of Spilsbury's anti-scorbutic drops promised to cure gout, scurvy, ulcers, and nervous complaints. They sold for 5 shillings each, vitamin C in fancy glass. A few treatments numbed the pain. Opium worked, if only to dull the edges of awareness. Others believed a dog's tongue could heal it, or that music might soothe the limb. None of it mattered. Gout remained untamed, and some even welcomed it. Letters from the 17th century praised the affliction as a friend of longevity. To have gout, they said, was proof that one had lived well and long enough to pay the price. In that strange logic, the pain itself became a badge of success. The disease of kings was no longer shameful, it was almost fashionable. By the mid-1900s, gout had lost its crown. No longer confined to palaces, it spread with prosperity. Butter, sugar, and wine were now within reach of the ordinary household. A British writer in 1964 called it a democratic affliction. "It is ridiculous," he wrote, "that a man should be barred from enjoying gout simply because he went to the wrong school." What had once defined status now defined society. Gout had slipped quietly from royal halls into suburban kitchens. Science had finally named the culprit: uric acid crystals, sharp as glass. But people had known for centuries that pleasure demanded payment. They had simply called it by another name. Every generation rediscovers its own version of excess. Sugar in tea, butter on bread, wine at dusk. And though the pain may fade, the lesson remains. The disease of kings never truly vanished. It merely changed its throne. It left the castles and found new homes in ordinary lives and modern habits. What had once been a sign of status became a mirror of comfort. In a world where abundance is common, perhaps the old lesson still stands, that what we enjoy most is often what teaches us the hardest truth. The halls of Europe are quiet now. The silver platters are tarnished, the laughter long gone. But history still remembers the echo of indulgence, the promise whispered behind every feast that abundance always asks for something in return. The affliction of kings was never only about pain. It was about appetite and the fragile balance between comfort and consequence. Somewhere in memory, a banquet still glows, wine poured too freely, laughter carried too far, and a king awake before dawn, touching the fire in his foot, understanding too late the cost of pleasure. For centuries, power and pain shared the same table, and history left behind one quiet truth, that even in times of plenty, the richest flavor in life has always been restraint.